This component of the identity leadership model seems to shift gears a bit, so to speak, at least to me. It seems like the two parts we've learned about so far establish what's necessary to emerge as a leader and to be successful. This component almost seems to suggest that those parts are just the foundation, and in practice, leaders build on that foundation. In discussing the elements that leaders can use to build on that, the authors of the New Psychology of Leadership help us also think about the role of leadership in social change. In being an entrepreneur of identity, leaders bring people together and subtly shape the goals and values of members of the group. In explaining the related leadership behaviors, the authors of the New Psychology of Leadership echo several things we learned in studying about inclusion and identity. Bringing people together by creating a shared sense of we and us within the group relates to what we know about the need to belong, as does the process of making different people all feel like they're part of the same group by increasing cohesion and inclusiveness within the group. Our knowledge of the social self and group culture helps us understand the implications of clarifying people's understanding of what the group stands for and what it does not stand for by defining core values, norms, and ideals. In framing the explanation of how leaders craft identity, we return to the concept of influence. This model takes a bit of a different perspective in that the discussion doesn't fit with the concepts of obedience and power that might typically be associated with leadership. Instead, the authors seem to be discussing how a leader can influence the group in a way that seems to more closely resemble conformity. That said, the initial explanation might not seem like it adds much to common sense. Given what we've already learned, it makes sense the source of influence would be someone who is prototypical, that it's less likely someone would be influenced if they don't identify with the group, and that the messages that will be influential are those that relate to the group identity. This component's about more than just those common sense ideas, though. You might have noticed that I use the word subtly in talking about how this component in the model is about shaping the group's goals. The authors of the text talk about molding the group, which is more fitting with what comes to mind as I think about this. It reminds me of the process of creating pottery on a wheel, except for a leader doesn't start with the group that's like a fresh ball of clay. There's usually something that brought the group together and establishes some of the group's norms. In the metaphor of pottery, they don't start with a shapeless ball of clay and decide they're going to make a cup or a bowl or a vase. It already has some shape. Like with clay, though, the idea of this component of the model is that a leader can influence the characteristics that shape takes on. In leadership, crafting identity includes influencing the group identity to establish the boundaries of membership and what it means to be a member of that group. In talking about the double labor of this process, the authors of the New Psychology of Leadership highlight both the reality of leadership and a part that makes me a little squirmy. They mention crafting a definition that fits the leader's purpose and doing so in a way that seems natural. It seems manipulative. As I've said, though, it is the reality of leadership, as the examples in the text illustrate. One way the leaders craft that identity is by telling stories to group members and about the group, directly and indirectly. Those stories articulate the group's identity and appeal to our interest in defining what it means to be a part of the group and how events impact the group. Leaders are embraced when they can act as interpreters, which also creates the opportunity to craft the group's identity by innovating on familiar themes. They influence the group by emphasizing the tradition, not by changing the story altogether. The leader needs to be sensitive to the context in which they're working. If we go back to the metaphor of working with clay on a pottery wheel, changing the story would be like trying to change a bowl into a vase. While it's possible to do that, it's also possible the entire thing will fall apart. Thinking about the idea of a leader influencing group identity leads to a bit of a complication of the idea of prototypicality. So far, we've primarily considered the process on the left, which is more reactive. The authors of the model note, though, that prototypicality is negotiable and actively constructed by the leaders. Prototypicality depends on how one views the relationship between the leader and the group identity. A leader's performances can influence the view of the relationship. Note that the term performance is in quotations in the model. This isn't meaning performance in terms of reaching group goals, but in terms of enacting a particular role, like the performance in a play. The nature of the process depends in part on how well defined the group is. If we go back in many situations, the leader-group relationship that determines prototypicality appears to be a bit of a paradox. We want leaders to be exceptional, but we also want them to be representative of us. Along with that, as we learned earlier, we don't want leaders to stand apart from the group. So, how do we reconcile that apparent contradiction? By being representative of the group, the shared values, norms, and so forth that define it across time. The leader needs to represent the group identity, not individual group members. So far, we've touched on the source and the content of influence. What about the target? The process of interpreting the group's identity allows a leader to harness the power of the group, in part because it allows them to define who is included in the group. The content of the message, the definition of identity put forth by the leader, will also determine who is interested in the message. The book talked about influence as having 3 parts, almost as if it was a linear process that starts with the source. As I think about it, though, it's more interrelated if we're thinking about the influence in the context of crafting group identity. If we think about crafting identity and the target of influence, it has a number of implications for social change. The authors note that the process of constructing identity can create groups with the size needed to affect society and the direction to do so. They also indicate that process contributes to the organization of the group, but I'm not sure I follow their connection on that part. That said, when the leader shapes the identity, they determine the boundaries of belonging and the size of the group. As the authors say, social categories are world-making resources. The leader directs those resources through the stories they tell about the group. The process of social change has been the focus of significant scholarly work, so much it could be an entire class in and of itself. In this class, I just want to encourage you to think about how leadership, and in particular identity leadership, relates to social change at a broad level. Given that, I selected resources about social change that were written for purposes other than the academic or the scholarly dialogue. One of the resources linked in the course site is from Animating Democracy, a program of the Americans for the Arts. While the model was developed in the context of arts and culture, it helps me think about how we can define the results of social change without making it seem so monumental it seems impossible. The site also includes examples of what each of the impacts might look like. Again, they're in the context of arts and culture, but those examples can help us think about other contexts. This also helps us think about how the group's identity will influence the impact it can have, and how the leader can craft identity to influence that impact. For example, if the group's identity is based on perceptions that a particular group is misunderstood and therefore marginalized, they might focus on efforts that have the impact of changing what people know. This might be a starting point for some social change initiatives, or it might be the primary goal. It makes me think of initiatives to increase understanding of some forms of developmental disabilities and mental health diagnosis. That might also influence behavior, but the knowledge is the initial goal. This module might provide a little different perspective on the things you've thought about before. In terms of follower behavior, it adds to what we've learned about inclusion and identity to help us understand both how and why people can be influenced. In terms of leader behavior, it helps us think about how understanding the importance of inclusion and identity allows someone to shape the actions of a group. That shaping can play out like the performance of a play or a musical act, and ultimately change the nature of the group, such that the leader themselves influences what's prototypical for the group. While that can come together in a way that's a bit smarmy at best, it also helps us think about how we can mobilize a group to affect positive social change.